You will not believe how people survive these days. Imagine waking up before sunrise. The walls feel cold. The floor is bare. Your only source of light, flickering candles or smoky oil lamps. Every corner might hide a hungry rat or a lurking spider. People whisper about curses. They glance over their shoulders, and it's not just rumors. Countless folks truly think demons lurk in dark alleys. Picture a cramped, muddy street. Water drips from overhead shutters. Chickens wander around. Horses clop past, dragging carts loaded with pungent vegetables and old barrels. The smell of wet straw and rotting trash overwhelms your nose. People toss waste out of windows without warning, so keep your head down. That splash might not be water. News travels slowly from town to town, yet gossip sparks wild tales. Neighbors might claim your yard is haunted by restless spirits. Others might think your family caused a bad harvest because you forgot to say a prayer at dawn. Superstitions spread like wildfire. A strange noise at night must be a phantom. A new disease in town must be a punishment from above. Now imagine the local healer. She might show up with a bundle of dried herbs and a few curious potions. She chants while waving her hands around a sick person's bed. Her breath smells like onions mixed with bitter roots. After she leaves, you wonder if she actually helped or made things worse. Yet in these days, you cling to hope wherever you can find it. People swear by herbal charms or colorful amulets to ward off evil. They hang sprigs of rosemary or little lumps of salt above their doors to block bad spirits. And let's not forget their bizarre cures. Some folks believe that swallowing ground-up pearls might help with a fever. Others trust in daily prayers while skipping meals in hopes of receiving mercy from the skies. Diseases spread quickly, sweaty fevers, inflamed sores, sudden chills. It feels like any cough could mean the end. Wash your hands? That's not always a habit. Sometimes the notion of cleanliness is overshadowed by fear of letting water open the pores to evil spirits. Public punishments in the market square rattle everyone's nerves. A young thief is locked in stocks, his face red with shame as passers-by sneer and toss scraps. Meanwhile, the blacksmith's hammer clangs against metal, forging dull gray swords or battered shields. The sound rings out, echoing through narrow lanes. People watch with tense fascination. Life is tough and justice is swift. You might hear the clang of a small bell signaling the arrival of a wandering monk. He shuffles on bare feet, chanting under his breath. He might carry a relic, a tiny bone fragment from a revered figure. The villagers gather around him, breathless with excitement. Some believe touching that bone can cure a fever. Others see it as a direct link to spiritual powers they can't explain. But there's another curious figure, an entertainer who wanders in with a grin, juggling 3 knives at once. His clothes are patched, and he smells of dust, sweat, and faint ale. Children clap. Grown-ups hold their breath, expecting a slip at any moment. The performer cracks jokes about the local baron's stinky moat, drawing uneasy laughter from the crowd. Careful, he mustn't go too far with his jests or risk angering the wrong person. Shops here aren't like modern stores. A small stall with rough wooden planks might have half a dozen eggs and a few lumps of cheese for sale. Behind it, a plump cat dozes. Next stall sells a few scraps of cloth, coarse wool in dull colors. Further down, you see a man slicing fish while swatting flies away. The stench is overwhelming, yet customers line up, hungry and tired. This is daily life, unfiltered, raw, and sometimes downright gross. In the evenings, the local tavern is packed with rowdy laughter and the smell of spilled ale. People cluster around a fire pit, listening to traveling minstrels sing about ancient heroes. Soot drifts upward, stinging your eyes. Patrons sip weak beer because it's sometimes safer than water. A fight might break out any second if someone believes they've been cheated in a game of dice or cards. Drunken shouts echo, and the tavern keeper bangs a ladle against the counter, yelling for order. Forget comfort. Beds might be nothing more than straw stuffed in a sagging cloth sack. Bugs crawl around in the night, biting ankles and leaving itchy welts. The wind shrieks through cracks in the walls. The roof might leak during storms, turning your bed into a soggy mess. It's no surprise people go to sleep wearing layers of clothes, just to keep warm. Suddenly, a distant bell rings from the church tower, a call to midnight prayer for the devout, or a caution about bandits on the roads outside the village. Some lock their doors and pray they won't hear howls in the darkness. Wolves roam the forests and bandits lurk at lonely crossroads. Tales of missing travelers spread fear. Yet these times also spark acts of courage and kindness. Neighbors help each other gather firewood or share a bit of bread with the needy. Does this sound unbelievable? It might, but it was normal for those living through it. They rarely questioned the constant hardships. They simply carried on. Life was fragile. Danger could strike at any moment, yet people still found reasons to sing, to laugh, and to hope. There's so much more to see and hear about these days that might make your hair stand on end. They thought the sky was full of warnings. Comets, eclipses, and strange lights could terrify a whole village. Some believed a red moon spelled doom. Others swore an eclipse meant the heavens were angry. People rushed to temples or churches, lighting candles and begging for protection. The fear was palpable. Mothers clutched their children, old folks muttered desperate prayers, and restless animals added to the panic with eerie wails. Many believed that in remote forests, witches brewed potions under twisted old oaks. A single raven perched on a fence might be seen as a sign of black magic. Folks whispered about hidden gatherings in moonlit clearings. They feared shapeshifters roaming the woods, and they blamed witches for unexplained events, crop failures, sudden illnesses, or even heartbreak. This fear often led to dangerous accusations, sometimes tearing communities apart. Tales of dragons and mighty giants were shared around smoky fires. Some swore they saw monstrous footprints or burnt marks left by beasts. Children gasped at these stories, eyes wide with terror and awe. Whether these tales were real or exaggerated, they kept imaginations aflame. Everyone loved to share a good yarn, especially if it involved terrifying creatures or heroic knights who faced them. Even daily storms could spark wild rumors. A strong gust of wind knocking down a barn must be the work of spirits. Thunder rumbling like a drum, a sure sign that some powerful force was unhappy. Lightning dancing across the sky could be interpreted as an omen of war or plague. People looked to the learned few for answers, but even scholars struggled to explain natural events without modern science. Some believed the earth stood still at the center of everything, with the sun, moon, and stars revolving around it. Questioning this view could lead to suspicion, or worse. Bold thinkers who suggested different models risked trouble. Many documents were hand-copied, often with mistakes or wild guesses mixed into the text. So theories about the cosmos were passed along with a mix of fact, rumor, and fear. Astrology was hugely popular. People studied the positions of planets to predict harvests, weather, or personal luck. Rulers consulted astrologers before battles or important decisions. A single alignment could mean victory or disaster. When a comet streaked across the sky, watchers quaked at the thought it brought a nasty sickness or signaled a king's downfall. The line between science and superstition was blurry. If someone got sick at an unlucky time, maybe a new moon or a specific planetary alignment, many assumed it was fate or a curse. Looking for cures, families would seek out herbalists or local wise women who might rely on star charts to decide the best time for certain treatments. The logic seems strange now, but it carried weight back then. We can't forget how stories of wonders and miracles spread. A relic that dripped water on a certain day of the year. A statue said to weep tears of blood. These events sent shockwaves through the region. Pilgrims flocked to see these marvels, leaving coins and offerings behind. Some returned with wild tales, claims of seeing lights or hearing heavenly voices. But not every wonder involved religion. Traveling shows boasted of two-headed calves or men with bizarre talents. Crowds paid a handful of coins to gape at freakish sights, while swindlers sometimes staged hoaxes. A disfigured mask or a convincing rumor could go a long way. Skeptics who dared point out fraud risked angry mobs or worse. No one liked having their illusions shattered. Rulers also clung to strange beliefs. A lord might refuse to build near a site rumored to be cursed. Another might pick an auspicious date for a ceremony based on star signs. Royal weddings were planned to avoid ill omens, like certain days of the week believed to bring heartbreak. Even major battles could be delayed if the stars weren't right. Superstition had a strong grip. Fear guided many behaviors, even in architecture. Some doorways were purposely narrow to block evil spirits. Some buildings were laid out in patterns thought to channel good energy. Gargoyles perched on church roofs, grimacing to scare away malign forces. People rarely questioned these odd designs. They felt safe with them in place. When misfortune struck, blame often fell on scapegoats, like travelers with strange accents or local outcasts known for odd habits. In times of famine or disease, these individuals could face mob anger. Suspicion was enough to spark violence. Without solid medical or scientific explanations, people turned to folklore. And that folklore could be brutal when fear and ignorance combined. Yet, amid all this worry, there were moments of sheer wonder. A beautiful sunrise after a night of storms could spark deep gratitude among villagers. A rainbow might be seen as a precious sign of hope. People in these days had a strong sense that everything was connected. Spirit, nature, and destiny intertwined in a giant puzzle. That puzzle was as mysterious as the starry sky at night. It's impossible to separate daily life from these beliefs. They shaped how people spoke, how they treated each other, and how they viewed triumph and tragedy. One might find a silver coin on the road and interpret it as a good omen, believing fortunes were changing. Another might lose a shoe in the mud and decide it was a hint of worse luck to come. In a world so full of uncertainties, superstition felt like a lifeline, even if it led to fear. Picture massive walls rising from rocky ground, stone piled upon stone, each placed with muscle and sweat. Imagine clanging tools echoing across a rugged site, blacksmiths hammering iron, carpenters sawing timber, masons chipping blocks under the blazing sun. Building a stronghold was no simple task. It took entire crews and years of backbreaking labor. Workers hoisted stones using creaky wooden cranes, ropes fraying from constant use, while supervisors yelled to keep everyone moving fast. All around, dust swirled as workers shoveled sand and lime to make mortar. Some coughed from the chalky haze, their skin coated with powder that clung to every pore. Masons balanced on rickety scaffolds, chiseling stones to fit tightly together. No big gaps allowed. A single slip could send a worker tumbling into the mud below. Yet they toiled on, day after day, with scuffed hands and weary eyes, driven by a mix of pride, hunger, and orders from those in charge. Over time, these walls grew thick, so thick that several horses could ride side by side on top of them. Archers needed space to patrol the ramparts, scanning for threats beyond the horizon. High towers sprouted at the corners, giving lookouts a view of rolling hills and winding roads. If an enemy army approached, signals were sent by blowing horns or waving flags. Residents scrambled to stock supplies and brace for siege. No one wanted to be caught unprepared behind incomplete defenses. Not every building was a towering fortress, though. Many common folks lived in humble structures made of wattle and daub, a woven framework of wooden strips coated with mud, straw, and clay. That mixture dried into a rough, earthy wall that could keep out drafts, mostly. Sometimes strong winds or heavy rains left big cracks, forcing families to patch up holes again and again. The roof might be thatched with bundles of reed or straw, which had to be replaced when rotted or blown away by storms. Inside a rough hut, the floor was often just packed dirt. A wooden table sat in the center, along with a few stools or benches. Smoke from a small hearth might billow around the room because chimneys weren't always common. Some homes had just a hole in the roof. Soot clung to rafters, blackening them over time and coating everything in a layer of grime. People breathed in the smoky air, their eyes watering as they cooked stews or roasted small cuts of meat over low flames. In wealthier households, floors might be covered with rushes. Stalks of plants spread across the ground. Over time, these rushes grew filthy, mixed with scraps of food, spilled drinks, and who knows what else. Replacing them wasn't a daily task, more like a big event every so often. Imagine the smell rising from those old rushes. The hidden insects scuttling underneath. Still, for many, it beat stepping directly on cold dirt or damp stone day after day. Castles were another world altogether. You might imagine a grand hall with soaring ceilings, but those tall spaces were often drafty and dark. Arrow slits or narrow windows let in limited light. Torches smoked in wall sconces, candles flickered on tables, shadows danced across the room. In the corners, servants hurried about, careful not to slip on the uneven floor or spill hot broth on a noble's lap. Furniture was heavy and sturdy, made to withstand wear and tear, but comfort was a luxury most couldn't fathom. Some grand residences had separate chambers for sleeping, storing food, and entertaining guests. Yet these rooms weren't always cozy. Stone walls trapped cold air, and the floors could freeze your feet in winter. Thick curtains hung around beds, providing a bit of warmth and a barrier against pests. Moths fluttered around flickering lights, bats sometimes lurked in upper rafters, and mice scampered in secret passages behind the walls. Maintenance was never ending. Roof tiles cracked under heavy snow, wooden beams creaked under constant stress. Leaks were common, leaving puddles in hallways. Rats might nest in hidden corners, nibbling on stored grain. The staff had to be vigilant. One slack moment and a corridor might become a swampy mess. Servants mopped up spills while cursing the cold stone that made their bones ache in the worst months of winter. In bustling towns, homes stood cramped together. Narrow streets meant neighbors practically lived on top of each other. Walls were so close that folks could stretch across an alley to touch the next building. Because space was limited, builders extended upper floors outward, creating a shadowy tunnel underneath. People joked about shaking hands through each other's windows, but in reality it added to the gloomy, tight feeling. Guild halls dominated some city districts. Carpenters, masons, and other skilled workers belonged to these groups, where they shared trade secrets and set standards. Entering a guild was no joke. Apprenticeship took years, and you had to prove yourself worthy. Senior members tested your work, checking every measurement, every detail. If you passed, you earned higher status and could charge respectable fees. But if you botched a job, word spread quickly, and your reputation took a major hit. Fires were a huge danger. With so many wooden buildings crammed in a small space, plus open hearths, candles, and torches, sparks could ignite whole districts. A single blaze might rampage through an entire neighborhood if the wind was strong. People desperately flung water from buckets, but firefighting tools were rudimentary at best. After such a disaster, the rubble smelled of charred beams, scorched thatch, and heartbreak. Many structures incorporated religious symbols, crosses, carved angels, or inscriptions meant to ward off evil. The idea was that a house protected by heavenly figures would be safe from malicious forces. Some builders believed special markings in the wood or stone gave extra protection. Superstition intertwined with construction, just as it influenced so many other aspects of life. Moats sometimes surrounded castles or fortified manors, not always filled with deep water, but sometimes just a ditch to make approach harder. If water was available, it could reek from stagnant algae and whatever else ended up there. It wasn't unusual for people to toss waste into the moat, turning it into a foul barrier that attackers had to cross. The stench alone might deter an unprepared army. While some lords or wealthy merchants could afford grand homes, most people had simpler goals: shelter from cold rain, storage for precious crops, a safe place to sleep. When storms raged, you prayed your roof wouldn't collapse. When war loomed, you hoped your walls, no matter how thin, would keep out pillagers. And during times of peace, you tried to repair cracks and reinforce timbers, saving money for the next inevitable emergency. People poured their hearts into the spaces they built. Even a small cottage represented the fruit of countless hours of labor. Stone masons pointed proudly to the archways they had shaped. Carpenters took satisfaction in sturdy beams that held roofs high. These were places of work, rest, and community gatherings, even if they lacked today's comfort or sanitation. The walls echoed with children's laughter, hushed arguments, the sizzling of meals over open flames, and the never-ending scuffle to keep everything from crumbling. Travelers approaching a medieval town might see a cluster of rooftops surrounding a central church spire, the tallest point around. Nearby, the protective walls stood like silent guardians, dotted with watchtowers. From afar, the sight could be awe-inspiring. Up close, you'd notice the patchwork repairs, the weathered gates, and the frayed ropes on the drawbridge. But in a world where daily life was a fight for survival, these constructions were feats of ingenuity and persistence. Maintenance required everybody's help. Neighbors pitched in to raise a barn or repair a broken gate. People might gather stones from a nearby field, pass them along in a chain, and lay them in place together. It was a social event, often accompanied by shared food, drink, and conversation. In the process, valuable skills passed from one generation to the next. Youngsters watched the older folks measure, cut, and fit pieces exactly where they belonged. That hard-earned knowledge shaped entire communities. Of course, unskilled laborers sometimes ended up doing the most grueling tasks, hauling heavy materials or mixing mortar until their arms felt like lead. Payment could be meager, and injuries were common. A crushed limb from a falling timber or a slipped chisel could mean a lifetime of disability, or worse. There were no modern safety nets. If you got hurt, your family had to manage somehow, relying on charity or the kindness of neighbors. Yet, each finished building, whether a fortified tower or a humble workshop, stood as proof that people could tame the harsh realities around them. The stone pillars, thick beams, and heavy doors offered a sense of security in a dangerous world. Even if the wind howled outside or raiders threatened the gate, those solid walls gave some comfort, and that comfort meant everything. Step inside a completed castle courtyard and you might find a bustling scene. Guards training with dull swords, stable hands tending horses, cooks plucking geese for the evening meal. Children might scurry between barrels, chasing each other in a game of tag. Merchants might arrive with wagons full of goods, hoping to sell to the Lord's household. The very stones that once lay scattered in a quarry had been fashioned into an entire living ecosystem, complete with its own sounds, smells, and daily dramas. If you kept walking, you might pass through a covered walkway leading to the grand hall. There, the household gathered for feasts or important announcements. Smoke drifted from a large fireplace, where wood crackled and popped. The table was set with thick trenchers of bread, wooden bowls of stew, and plenty of cheap ale. Nobles had finer cups, maybe made of metal or horn, while common folk made do with simpler vessels, clay or plain wood. The flickering light illuminated carved beams overhead, each telling stories of hunts or epic legends. Down narrow corridors, small chambers stored grain, barrels of salted fish, or casks of wine. The damp, cool air helped preserve goods, though rats and mold were constant threats. Servants scurried in and out, fetching ingredients for the day's meals, or organizing supplies for winter. Doors and gates creaked on their hinges, reminding you that everything needed oiling and care to last through the seasons. The difference between these solid fortress halls and a peasant's hut was stark, yet both structures faced the same enemies: bad weather, rot, pests, and the unstoppable march of time. While a lord might have more resources to fix leaky roofs, peasants had to manage with the bare minimum. Yet, each tried to create a place to call home, a spot to keep warm in winter's biting chill and safe in the face of uncertainty. Carrying water from a nearby well or stream was part of life for many households. Wells became communal gathering spots, where neighbors caught up on gossip while waiting their turn to fill buckets. That precious resource was hauled inside, splashing along the way to be used for cooking, washing, or drinking, although some worried about contamination from latrines or animals grazing nearby. Proper sanitation was a constant challenge. But no matter how rough these living conditions might seem to us now, they had their own sense of routine and comfort for those who inhabited them. Shared experiences built strong bonds. Sitting around a hearth, telling stories, playing simple games, or just dozing off to the crackle of the fire became cherished moments after a long day's labor. Through thick and thin, people found ways to adapt their spaces to survive and occasionally to thrive. If walls could talk, they would tell stories of whispered secrets, heated arguments, joyous reunions, and desperate last stands. They would recall the laughter of children chasing pets across dusty courtyards, the panic when an enemy was spotted on the horizon, the relief when fresh supplies arrived after a harsh winter. Brick by brick, timber by timber, these buildings shaped the texture of daily life, both practical and emotional. That was the reality for those who lived behind stone battlements or simple wooden frames, a life measured by chores, seasons, and uncertain fortunes. A life where the walls you built might mean the difference between safety and ruin. Knights were not just armored warriors clanking around on horseback. They were symbols of status, living proof of a strict social order. But training to become one was no joke. Imagine starting out as a page at a noble household, maybe at 7 or 8 years old. You served meals, cleaned equipment, and learned basic court manners. You also practiced riding with a wooden sword, dreaming of real steel someday. Every muscle ached at the end of the day, but you kept pushing forward. There was honor on the horizon. As you got older, you advanced to squire. That meant caring for a knight's horse, polishing his armor until it gleamed, and learning the arts of combat. Your master might be stern, shouting commands while you lunged with a wooden spear, or forcing you to hold a heavy shield in place until your arms shook like leaves. Woe to you if you dozed off or let a horse wander off. Punishments ranged from extra chores to a good scolding in front of everyone. Eventually, though, if you stuck it out, you might be dubbed a knight, an honor that made your heart pound with pride. Knighthood also came with duties. You pledged loyalty to a lord or king, promising to fight on command and protect the weak. That was the idea anyway. In practice, knights could be as rough as any other armed fighter. Some stuck to lofty ideals of chivalry, defending ladies' honor, upholding justice, but others saw knighthood as a ticket to riches. When war broke out, knights assembled in formidable cavalry units, charging across battlefields, lances aimed forward. The thunder of hooves shook the ground, and the sight of polished armor against the sun could terrify enemies. Battle, though, was brutal. Those shining suits got dented fast when axes and maces came crashing down. Even if you survived, you might be taken hostage and ransomed back to your family. Armor was expensive, and so were horses. A single campaign could ruin you if you lost your prized destrier, the war horse you'd trained with. Some knights ended up in debt, forced to sell land or valuables to replace their gear. Not exactly a fairy tale. While knights served lords, peasants toiled under the open sky, from dawn until dusk. These were the majority, the backbone of society, working the fields so everyone could eat. They plowed, planted seeds, weeded rows of vegetables, and harvested crops under the scorching sun or in the biting chill of early spring. Their hands grew calloused, their backs bowed, and their clothes became ragged. Few had more than a single set of garments, so they patched holes until the fabric was beyond saving. Peasant life was a constant fight against hunger, disease, and heavy taxes. If the harvest was poor, due to drought, flood, or pests, everyone felt the pinch. You might be forced to give your last handful of grain to the local lord as rent or tribute, leaving your family on the brink of starvation. Some peasants rebelled, refusing to pay or rising up in angry mobs, but such uprisings were often crushed quickly. The threat of harsh punishment loomed like a shadow over every village. Despite the hardships, peasants found ways to persevere. Families worked together, husbands, wives, and children sharing tasks in the fields. Neighbors helped each other bring in the harvest or fix a broken wagon wheel. Simple gatherings took place around a small fire at night, with folk songs or storytelling to lift spirits. A quick laugh or a few moments dancing could make a tough day less painful. Even a simple treat, like a fresh loaf of bread, felt like a blessing if your belly rumbled often. Their homes were modest, straw roofs, earthen floors, a few wooden utensils. Furniture might be handmade, roughly carved from local timber. If an animal wandered inside at night, no one was shocked. Many peasants kept livestock close, seeking warmth or protecting them from thieves. Privacy was rare. Large families squeezed into cramped spaces, with grandparents, parents, and children all huddled together against the cold. Still, these little huts were the center of peasant life, where they laughed, cried, and rested their aching bodies when the day's labor was done. In contrast, the church had towering cathedrals with soaring arches and colorful windows that cast shimmering light onto stone floors. But the church's reach went far beyond grand buildings. Clergy played a massive role in daily life. Priests baptized newborns, heard confessions, and officiated weddings. Bishops oversaw entire regions, sometimes holding enormous power that rivaled local lords. Monks filled monasteries, devoted to a life of prayer, copying texts and strict routines. For many, religion was the lens through which they viewed the world. People believed their every action would be judged in the afterlife. Sin weighed heavily on the conscience. Lying, stealing, or even a jealous thought could fill you with dread about eternal punishment. Holy days provided relief from the grind. Festivals celebrating saints or sacred events brought a day or more of feasting, music, and community gatherings. Folks arrived at churches in their best clothes, hoping to impress neighbors and earn blessings from above. But the church was not always gentle. If you challenged official teachings, you risked a label like heretic. That could bring serious consequences: public humiliation, forced penance, or even execution. The church worked closely with secular leaders to maintain control, using threats of excommunication to keep noble families in line. Excommunication was a powerful weapon. Being cut off from the church meant isolation from community life, terror about one's soul, and a complete social curse. Clergy, too, had their own hierarchy. Bishops might rule from lavish residences, hosting grand banquets much like princes. Meanwhile, parish priests lived modestly, tucked away in small villages, dealing with everyday folk. Some priests truly cared for their flock, visiting the sick, sharing meager supplies in times of famine. Others were less virtuous, rumored to be greedy or indulging in forbidden pleasures. Corruption within church ranks was whispered about, but confronting it was risky. Monks and nuns followed strict orders, each group with its own rules. Some emphasized silence, others manual labor or meditation. Monasteries often produced wine, ale, cheese, or honey, supporting themselves through trade. Skilled scribes copied books by hand in scriptoria, preserving knowledge that might otherwise vanish in the chaos of the era. Libraries in monasteries became treasure troves of literature, theology, and even ancient scientific texts. Meanwhile, the vow of poverty meant to remind monks they served a higher cause. But ironically, some monasteries grew quite wealthy through donations and land grants. Pilgrimages were a huge part of religious life. People traveled, sometimes hundreds of miles, to visit sacred shrines. They believed these journeys could cleanse them of sins or help them gain miracles. A pilgrimage was grueling. You walked on dirt roads, faced potential attacks from bandits, and slept in cramped inns or under the open sky. Yet pilgrims pressed on, chanting prayers, swapping stories, and forging bonds with strangers who shared the same quest. Reaching a holy site brought tears, gratitude, and a sense of deep accomplishment. Amid all this, you had folks who occupied that tricky middle ground, like merchants and craftspeople. They weren't peasants, but they weren't nobles either. They might own shops or workshops in town, employing apprentices and building modest wealth. Some joined guilds, rising in social ranks if they produced exceptional goods or managed successful trades. Respect and scorn could both come their way. Nobles sometimes resented merchants who flaunted their growing prosperity, while peasants might envy those with better living conditions. Yet knights, peasants, and the church all tangled together in everyday life. Knights might extort higher taxes to fund wars, pressing peasants to the brink, while the church demanded offerings and tithes. Farmers tilled fields owned by a local abbey, providing grain to feed monks or fueling church feasts. A lord might donate land to a religious order to secure prayers for his soul. Power was layered. No single group ruled outright, but alliances and rivalries shaped each region's destiny. When rumors of plague spread, knights might flee to fortified castles, peasants cowered in their huts, and clergy prayed for divine mercy. No one was immune. Disease struck all classes, sometimes altering the balance of power. If a noble family died out, peasants might gain freedoms from the next ruler, or lose more rights if a harsher lord took over. The church sometimes stepped in to offer relief, distributing bread or caring for orphans, but resources were limited, and corruption occasionally swallowed funds meant for the needy. Knights also participated in tournaments, glamorous events mixing sport and warfare. Jousts drew crowds from far and wide, eager to watch heavily armored combatants clash with lances. Trumpets blared, banners flapped, and excited chatter buzzed among spectators. But these contests were dangerous. Riders thundered toward each other, risking broken bones or worse if they landed wrong. Victory could bring fame and fortune. Knights wore ribbons or tokens from ladies who admired their bravery. Meanwhile, peasants looked on, maybe cheering for the knight from their local estate, living the excitement vicariously before returning to the daily grind. Manners at court were precise. Bow at the right angle, address lords and ladies with the correct titles, never speak out of turn. Knights had to learn these rituals if they wanted favor. And more importantly, if they wanted a chance at land grants or military commands. A slip of the tongue might result in shame or the loss of a valuable alliance. Diplomacy was a subtle dance. Noble families arranged marriages to forge ties, hoping to expand their influence, while clergy acted as advisors or mediators when tempers flared. Peasant communities had their own sets of unwritten codes. Help your neighbor, respect the elder who's seen countless harvests, and don't cross the local bailiff if you value your home. Gossip moved fast in village life. A stolen chicken or a secret affair might be the talk of the town for weeks. Church bells marked the passing of time. Morning prayers, midday respite, evening mass, and peasants shaped their work around these chimes, sowing seeds or harvesting wheat in the hours of daylight, then collapsing at dusk to snatch some precious rest. At the heart of it all was a sense of duty, to the land, to the Lord, and to the faith. Knights found purpose in defending realms or expanding them in raids. Peasants found meaning in feeding their families and caring for their small patch of earth, and church figures believed they served the highest power of all. Of course, humans being humans, conflicts arose, hypocrisy flourished, and tensions simmered beneath the surface. But the interplay of these roles sustained the broader community, allowing it to persist through famine, war, and plague. Those who tried to jump from one role to another faced big hurdles. A peasant who saved enough coins to buy a horse and armor might hope to fight as a mercenary or attract a patron's attention, but the established knights often scoffed at such upstarts. Clergy who questioned standard doctrine risked condemnation, and a knight refusing to serve a lord's command might lose land or face banishment. Everyone was bound by expectations, and yet some defied them, becoming legendary outlaws, wandering hermits, or radical preachers stirring the pot of social unrest. Even the clothing told a story. Knights wore mail hauberks or plate armor, shining helmets, and surcoats emblazoned with family crests. Priests and monks, often dressed in simple robes or habits, belted at the waist. Nuns covered their hair with plain wimples and veils. Peasants wore rough tunics, fraying at the edges, fastened with simple belts of rope or old leather. Shoeless children scampered around muddy yards, their feet caked in grime. It was a vivid tapestry of appearances, each style marking one's place in the social puzzle. Meals also varied. Knights and nobles might feast on roasted game, fine wine, and spiced dishes served on metal plates. Bread trenchers overflowed with stews, while minstrels played lutes in the background. Peasants stuck to hearty porridge, black bread, and vegetables from their gardens. Meat was a rare treat. Church figures ate in communal dining halls, sometimes in silence to honor devotion, nibbling on fish and simple fare, unless a feast day allowed for more abundance. The difference in diets was obvious, and it reminded everyone who held wealth and influence. Still, peasants looked to the church for solace, knights sought the church's blessing for their ventures, and clergy prayed for order in a world often teetering on chaos. Each group leaned on the others, often without realizing it. Like cogs in a creaky machine, they needed each other for everything to function. The knight collected taxes from peasants, who in turn received spiritual comfort from priests, who needed the knight's protection for church lands, an unsteady balance held together by shared necessity. Sometimes peasants pinned their hopes on a kind knight who might champion their cause before the Lord. Occasionally, a church official would intervene to ease the burdens of taxes or forced labor. Stories circulated about saintly bishops who shielded the poor from merciless barons, or about knights who distributed bread after returning from a successful campaign. But such acts often depended on personal conscience, a gamble in a realm where power could twist even the best intentions. Through it all, the fields were plowed, prayers were whispered, swords were sharpened, and bargains were struck in shadowy corners. Nobles and clergy shaped the grand narratives, yet peasants' sweat watered the crops and turned the wheels of rural life. The interplay was messy, full of alliances, betrayals, generosity, exploitation, devotion, and doubt. No one was truly isolated. Each role needed the others, for better or worse. The pounding of war drums, the shrill blast of trumpets. Imagine the ground trembling beneath your feet as lines of infantry march forward. This was the reality of battle, mud, blood, and the clash of steel echoing for miles. Soldiers carried long spears, axes, or simple farming tools turned into weapons. Some trudged barefoot, unprotected except for a ragged shirt. Others wore patched-up armor, chipped from past skirmishes. Everyone felt the terror that came with the possibility of never seeing home again. In the distance, mounted cavalry waited for the signal to charge. Huge war horses snorted clouds of hot breath in the morning chill. Knights in heavy armor gripped lances, scanning the enemy ranks with narrowed eyes. One command, and they surged forward, hooves thundering. Imagine being a foot soldier, seeing that wall of horses bearing down, dust swirling, lances aimed like deadly spikes. You'd brace your shield or spear, your heart hammering in your chest as you realized there was nowhere to run. Weapons varied wildly. Some foot soldiers relied on swords, straight blades meant for slashing and thrusting. Others carried axes with heavy heads to smash shields or break bones under armor. The pike, a very long spear, was favored by disciplined units who formed tight formations called pike squares, an intimidating forest of pointed tips. Crossbowmen and archers hung back, firing bolts and arrows in high arcs. A volley could blot out the sun for a moment, sending a storm of sharp points whistling down on the enemy. Armor also came in many types. Wealthy knights might wear suits of plate, polished metal plates covering arms, legs, and torso, each piece riveted together. Less fortunate fighters had chainmail shirts, thousands of interlinked metal rings that protected the body from cutting blows, but could still be pierced by powerful thrusts or crossbow bolts. Some soldiers wore nothing more than a sturdy leather tunic or a simple helm, hammered out by a local blacksmith. They prayed skill or luck would keep them alive. Battles usually started with some form of intimidation or skirmishing. Archers losing arrows, cavalry testing the flanks, or groups of lightly armed fighters rushing forward to gauge the opponent's strength. Thick clouds of dust kicked up in the chaos, mixing with the smell of sweat and fear. Drummers beat a steady rhythm to keep formations in time, and banners fluttered overhead so comrades could recognize each other in the haze. A single wrong step or a missed signal could throw an entire unit into disarray. When the main clash began, it was chaos, shields splintering under crushing blows, swords ringing off helmets, men yelling orders that few could hear. Horses screamed when struck, and soldiers stumbled over the bodies of the fallen. Visibility might be poor from the swirl of dust and smoke if fires started or cannons, in later periods, roared. Some armies used early gunpowder weapons, small cannons on clumsy wooden frames. They weren't always reliable. Sometimes they exploded on the spot. But if they worked, they tore massive gaps in enemy lines. Commanders stood on slight rises or behind the lines, trying to coordinate troops. They used flags, horns, or messengers running back and forth, risking their lives to deliver orders. If the commander fell, confusion could spread, and the army might lose heart. Morale was everything. If soldiers believed they were winning, they fought on. But if panic took hold, entire regiments might break and flee, trampling each other in the rush to escape. Fear was as deadly as any sword. Sieges were another nightmare. A fortress or walled city could hold out for weeks or months, depending on food supplies and the attacker's patience. Ladders and siege towers allowed assaulting troops to climb walls, all while defenders poured boiling water, hot sand, or pitch onto them from above. Archers inside the walls shot arrow after arrow, trying to pick off the attackers clinging to ladders. Sometimes the sky was filled with a barrage of flaming arrows, sparking small fires wherever they landed. To breach walls, armies built battering rams, massive logs with iron heads, swung back and forth to smash gates. Siege engineers even constructed covered walkways to shield attackers from enemy arrows. Others attempted mining, digging tunnels beneath the walls, propping them up with wooden supports, then setting these supports on fire to collapse a section. Defenders frantically tried to detect and counter these tunnels by digging their own. Battles raged underground in cramped tunnels, where men fought with daggers or pickaxes in near darkness. Catapults or trebuchets hurled huge stones, hoping to break fortifications or crush the defenders' morale. The whoosh and snap of a trebuchet's arm, powered by a heavy counterweight, launched projectiles high over walls. Stones crashed down, smashing rooftops or harming crowds of defenders. Sometimes attackers launched rotting animal carcasses or other foul objects, hoping to spread disease inside the besieged city. The smell alone could be horrifying, and fear of plague could unravel a garrison's will to fight. Defending a city wasn't easy either. Civilians crammed behind walls, rationing food and water, uncertain when relief would come. Wells might dry up or become contaminated. People huddled in cellars during bombardments, listening to the thud of stones hammering their homes. Disease spread quickly in such cramped conditions. Dysentery, fevers, and infections from minor wounds. Morale wavered with each day of hunger or each new casualty. Still, defenders had the advantage of walls and high vantage points, so a stout defense could hold off a larger army for a surprisingly long time. Some armies employed mercenaries, professional soldiers who fought for pay rather than loyalty or cause. They came from different regions, spoke various languages, and had their own codes. Mercenaries often brought specialized skills in archery, pikemanship, or siegecraft. Their presence could tilt the balance, but if the money ran out or the battle turned hopeless, they might desert or switch sides. War was a business to them, and profits mattered more than honor. Knights wanted glory in open battle, particularly the cavalry charge, but foot soldiers knew the real grit came after the cavalry had smashed into the enemy lines, when swirling melee turned into a brawl. In that chaos, skill mixed with luck. A well-trained soldier might meet a raw recruit, or a heavily armored knight might be brought down by a simple peasant with a sharp spear and good timing. The line between life and death was razor thin. Victory didn't always go to the side with more troops or shinier armor. Terrain made a huge difference. A muddy field could bog down cavalry, high ground gave archers better range, and narrow passes could neutralize large numbers. Commanders studied maps, though maps weren't as accurate as modern ones, and scouted the land before committing troops. A surprise ambush or a well-executed flank attack could change everything in minutes. Rumors of reinforcements arriving sometimes shattered an enemy's nerve, even if those reinforcements never showed. Communication was spotty at best. One unit might be winning on one side of the battlefield, while another was collapsing on the opposite flank. Soldiers generally only knew what they could see around them. Leaders relied on messengers weaving between pockets of fighting, sometimes too late to prevent a disaster. When an army finally broke, it was a rout. Men throwing down weapons, tripping over each other in a mad dash to safety. The victors might pursue, cutting down stragglers or capturing valuable prisoners for ransom. Captives faced uncertain fates. Some were spared if they could afford to pay, or if they had important family ties. Commoners might be sold into slavery or conscripted as forced labor. The aftermath of a battle was grim. Fields littered with bodies, the groans of the wounded, and looters picking through gear for valuables. Peasants from nearby villages sometimes crept in to scavenge weapons or armor to sell, or simply to find scraps of food from abandoned supplies. The smell of death lingered in the air, along with the cries of grieving families searching for their lost ones. Battles were often decided quickly. Some ended within hours. But sieges dragged on, draining resources and morale. Starving defenders sometimes ate horses, dogs, or worse to survive. Attackers could starve too if supply lines were cut or plague broke out in their camp. War was unpredictable, shaped by disease as much as sword and spear. Commanders had to worry about desertion. If conditions grew unbearable, soldiers might slip away during the night, deciding life on the run was better than dying under a hail of arrows or in a disease-ridden camp. Unusual weapons popped up from time to time. Some armies experimented with Greek fire, a volatile substance that burned even on water, terrifying naval foes. There were stories of war wagons used like mobile forts, each bristling with crossbowmen, forming defensive squares on open ground. Others tested early hand cannons, small handheld tubes that spewed lead shot in a burst of smoke and flame, though reloading them was painfully slow. Many considered gunpowder a passing fad at first, but it would eventually change warfare forever. Defensive structures evolved to counter new threats. Towers on castle walls became round instead of square, reducing blind spots and resisting battering rams more effectively. Gatehouses grew more elaborate, with multiple portcullises and murder holes, openings above the passage from which defenders could drop stones or hot liquids onto attackers. Thick curtain walls angled outward at the base, deflecting siege projectiles. Some castles featured concentric walls, an outer ring and an inner ring, forcing any attacker to capture the first wall before dealing with the second. Diplomacy and trickery were often used instead of brute force. A crafty commander might bribe a gate guard to open the city at night, or spies inside the walls might sabotage defenses or light beacons to guide attackers under cover of darkness. False flags were hoisted to confuse defenders and misinformation spread to sow panic. If a city believed an enormous army was at its gates when only a small force approached, it might surrender prematurely to avoid a long siege. War was a grim fact of life. Rulers fought over territory, succession disputes, or just plain ambition. Some conflicts lasted decades, scarring whole generations. Villages were burned, fields trampled, and roads plagued by marauders. Refugees wandered from place to place, hoping to find safety and food. Knights might arrive promising protection but demand heavy tribute in return. Or a mercenary band might roll in, offering to guard the population if paid well. Peace was fragile, easily broken by the next greedy warlord or princely feud. But even in the midst of carnage, codes of conduct sometimes emerged. Knights took pride in chivalry, at least in theory. They might spare a noble foe, treat him with respect, and exchange ransom for his release. Defiling churches or harming non-combatants was frowned upon, though not everyone adhered to those rules. Some commanders believed in total war, burning crops and terrorizing local populations to weaken enemy support. Others tried to maintain discipline, punishing looters or murderers in their ranks to keep an honorable reputation. Tournaments offered a taste of warfare without the finality of real death, though accidents happened. Knights practiced jousting, melee combat, and mounted games, sharpening their skills while providing entertainment for spectators. Victorious knights could earn fame and valuable prizes, forging alliances through these festive displays. However, nothing truly replicated the confusion, fear, and unpredictability of an actual battlefield. War was a beast of its own, a swirling cauldron of screams, steel, courage, and desperation. When the fight was over, survivors limped away with fresh scars, physical or emotional. Some carried crippling wounds, diseases, or shattered hopes. Others found brief glory, returning home with spoils taken from fallen foes. But beyond the battlefield, families mourned lost sons, wives waited for husbands who never came back, and towns struggled to rebuild from scorched fields and looted barns. In that sense, every battle cast a long shadow, marking a community for years or even centuries. And yet, leaders kept fighting, convinced of their right or their destiny. Chroniclers wrote down tales of heroic charges or last stands, leaving out the ugliness that didn't fit the heroic image. Poets sang about knights who fought honorably, forgetting the terror and blood. Over time, myths overshadowed reality. But for those who lived through it, war was a raw, jarring experience. Sweaty palms gripping a weapon, ears pounding with the roar of conflict, eyes stinging from smoke and dust, and the unshakable sense that fate was decided in frantic moments of life and death. Ruthless laws kept people in line, and the punishments for breaking them could be downright horrifying. Imagine standing in the center of town, locked in heavy wooden stocks, unable to move your hands or feet, while the crowd jeered, shouted insults, and hurled rotten vegetables at your face. If you were unlucky, the onlookers might throw stones instead. The stocks forced you to lean forward at an awkward angle, back aching, legs trembling. Hours felt like an eternity. Humiliation was part of the sentence. If the authorities deemed you guilty of theft, cheating, or simply angering the wrong person. But the stocks were just the tip of the iceberg. The pillory worked in a similar way, clamping your head and hands so you couldn't protect yourself from the mob's fury. The crowd's reaction depended on the severity of your offense. Some folks might just gawk or spit in disgust. Others might be riled up by rumors and lash out with fists, sticks, or worse. There was little sympathy for criminals in these times. Many believed fear was the best way to maintain order. Public hangings drew morbidly curious spectators. A tall wooden gallows was erected, ropes dangling ominously. Guards marched the condemned up a set of rickety steps, every eye in the crowd fixed on their trembling legs. An official or priest might read out the charges in a booming voice. Children sometimes crowded in with the adults, watching in a mix of horror and fascination. The hush right before the trapdoor opened was chilling. Every breath felt heavy, pregnant with dread. Then, a sudden drop, a thud, and the crowd either gasped or cheered, depending on their mood or the crime's nature. Beheadings were reserved for certain offenses or high-status offenders. The executioner, often hooded or just grim-faced, swung a heavy axe or sword. In theory, a single clean blow ended it quickly, but botched attempts happened. That meant multiple strikes, each more awful than the last. Blood spattered the platform, and onlookers shrank back. Yet they still stared, unable to tear their eyes away. Sometimes the severed head was displayed on spikes, a grim warning to anyone contemplating similar crimes. But some punishments were more psychological than lethal. Take the ducking stool, used against those accused of scolding or being a troublesome woman and sometimes suspected witches. The offender was strapped to a chair attached to a long wooden beam, then dunked into a river or pond repeatedly. Onlookers laughed or jeered as the victim sputtered for air. Was it fair? Probably not. But this era didn't always care about fairness. Public shame held strong sway, and many felt that fear of the ducking stool might keep gossip and disorderly behavior in check. Trial by ordeal tested the accused in bizarre ways. One method involved plunging your hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone. Afterward, the hand was bandaged, and if the wounds healed quickly, as judged by clergy, it was taken as a sign of innocence. Another involved walking over hot plowshares, heated metal blades on the ground, and then having your feet inspected for burns. These trials were rooted in the belief that a higher power would protect the innocent and reveal the guilty. Of course, human meddling could tip the odds. Maybe the water wasn't as hot, or the plowshares cooled just enough for a favored defendant. Then there was trial by combat. Two people, maybe they were disputing land or accusing each other of serious wrongdoing, settled the matter with weapons. The winner was in the right by divine judgment, or so they believed. If you lacked fighting skills, you might hire a champion to battle on your behalf. Imagine watching a tense duel between heavily armored opponents, each blow echoing around the arena while the audience roared. When one fighter yielded or died, the verdict was final. In some regions, even women and elderly folks had the right to trial by combat, though the rules varied from place to place. Thieves might lose a hand for repeated offenses. The local authority would chop it off, sometimes in front of the community, leaving the criminal permanently scarred. Brandings were also common, searing a letter into the skin with a hot iron to mark a person's crime. An example might be a letter T for thief on the cheek or forehead. That stigma followed them everywhere. People recognized the mark instantly, crossing the street or refusing to offer help or employment. In a society where everyone lived close to the edge, that brand made life nearly impossible. Nobles and royalty played by different rules. They could face exile, sent away from their lands, stripped of titles, forced to roam foreign territories. Imprisonment in a distant fortress was another tactic. A fallen noble might find themselves locked in a chilly tower with barely any comforts. Their family estate might be seized, their name dragged through the mud, all because of a political misstep or perceived betrayal. For the powerful, disgrace often stung worse than physical torture. Losing face in front of peers could be a fate worse than death. Speaking of torture, it was sometimes used to extract confessions or hidden information. The rack, a gruesome device, stretched victims' limbs until joints popped. People might scream for mercy, eyes bulging in agony. Another tool, the thumbscrew, crushed digits between metal plates. There was also the strappado, tying a person's hands behind their back, hoisting them off the ground with a rope, then letting them drop suddenly. Shoulders dislocated with sickening cracks. Meanwhile, interrogators repeated questions, demanding confessions or names of accomplices. A common belief was that pain forced out the truth, though desperate victims might say anything to make it stop. False confessions happened often, leading to tragic outcomes. But the authorities clung to these methods, convinced they maintained law and order. Torture chambers were hidden within castles, fortress dungeons, or city prisons. Some rooms were small, damp, and only lit by a single torch. The stench of sweat, blood, and stale air was overwhelming. In corners, rusted chains and suspicious stains hinted at the horrors inflicted there. The church had its own punishments for sins or heresy. Someone accused of heresy might be forced to wear a special garment in public, brightly colored with symbolic shapes meant to shame them. A penitent's parade could wind through city streets, the accused reciting prayers loudly for all to hear. If they failed to show proper remorse, harsher measures followed, being turned over to secular authorities for possible execution, often by burning. Public burnings drew huge crowds, and the smell of smoke mingled with terrified screams, burned into people's memories for years. In some places, if you couldn't pay your debts, you might land in a debtor's prison. Conditions were rough: overcrowded cells, unsanitary corners, no guaranteed meals unless friends or family brought food. Men, women, and even children could end up locked away for owing money. Some prisoners negotiated with guards to run small businesses from their cells, desperately scraping coins to reduce their debts. It was a grim cycle: no way to earn money outside, yet stuck in prison until you settled your account. At times, entire families might be punished for one member's crime, property seized, children forced into servitude, or relatives exiled along with the culprit. This collective punishment enforced loyalty and obedience. People thought twice before committing offenses that could doom their loved ones. Lords or kings could also seize hostages from rival families to guarantee good behavior. Imagine living under guard in a rival's castle, uncertain if you'd be executed if your relatives rebelled. Public humiliation took many forms, like wearing a shame mask, an iron contraption with a grotesque animal face or a mocking expression. Offenders had to parade around wearing it, while townspeople pointed and laughed. These masks might have bells attached, jingling with each step, adding to the embarrassment. Others faced the scold's bridle, a metal headpiece with a tongue depressor that prevented speech, used on those who nagged, spread rumors, or otherwise annoyed authorities. It was painful and humiliating, leaving bruises or cuts on the face. Oddly, some punishments seemed more comedic, like carrying a heavy stone around town for a day, wearing donkey ears, or being forced to ride backward on a donkey. But even these silly-sounding penalties carried a heavy social stigma. People understood the message: step out of line, and you'll be made a fool of in front of everyone. Peer pressure was massive. Neighbors might treat you like an outcast for years after, refusing to buy your goods or even speak to you. Punishments also depended on local customs. A minor crime in one region could lead to severe torture in another. Judges wielded immense power, often interpreting vague laws as they saw fit. If you crossed a powerful noble, you might suffer punishments out of proportion to your misdeed. On the other hand, a wealthy offender might buy leniency with a bribe or a favor. Corruption thrived where laws were broad and record-keeping was poor. Eccentric rules popped up now and then, like fining people for wearing clothes above their social station. If a peasant dared to don expensive fabrics, local officials might punish them for stepping outside their class. These sumptuary laws kept people in their place. Lords believed that order in society required each class to appear distinctly different. Violators were shamed or fined, reminding everyone that wealth or status decided what you could wear. And if someone had stolen to afford such clothes, that was double trouble, a nasty combination of theft and impertinence. For travelers, unfamiliar local laws could be a nightmare. You might accidentally break a rule you never knew existed. Maybe fishing in a certain stream was forbidden, or lighting a fire near a church was considered sacrilege. If no one warned you, you'd face the wrath of town elders or a local knight. Some unlucky wanderers were whipped out of town for trivial reasons. To avoid trouble, merchants often hired local guides or interpreters to help them navigate these legal minefields. Despite the cruelty, some saw these punishments as communal entertainment, especially public events like hangings, brandings, or the pillory. People gathered in a carnival-like atmosphere, sellers hawking pies or ale, children running about underfoot. For many, it was the only show they ever witnessed, offering grim excitement in a bleak routine. Authorities believed such spectacles deterred crime, hoping the fear of public shame or agony would keep the restless in line. However, these methods weren't always effective. Petty crime persisted, rebellions erupted, and noble feuds raged on. Many offenders simply learned to be sneakier, evading capture or fleeing to new towns where no one recognized them. The threat of barbaric punishment might have curbed some wrongdoing, but it also created an undercurrent of terror and distrust in local communities. Nonetheless, whether just or not, these laws and penalties shaped everyday life. The stocks in the market square, the gallows on a hill, the brand on someone's cheek, constantly reminded citizens that stepping out of line could ruin them. Innocent or guilty, no one wanted to experience the sting of a whip or the humiliation of public scorn. Meanwhile, those in power used fear to maintain order, convinced that a heavy hand was needed to keep society from unraveling. Imagine a stuffy room cluttered with clay jars, dried plants, and a lingering odor of sour herbs. A hunched figure in a rough apron hovers over a small table, grinding leaves and roots into a paste. This is the local healer, sometimes called the wise woman or bone setter. She has no official license, just knowledge passed down through whispers and old texts. Patients come to her coughing, limping, or clutching wounded limbs. If you're lucky, she might offer a poultice that actually helps. But some cures are downright strange. Take, for instance, the belief that crushed pearls could ease a fever, or that swallowing gold flakes might ward off certain illnesses. These substances were pricey, so only the wealthy dared try them. Others swore by odd diets, drinking vinegar mixed with ground herbs, fasting on certain days, or chewing dried toad as a remedy for warts. Did these methods work? Hardly ever. But hope was in short supply, and desperation drove people to attempt nearly anything. Phlebotomy, bleeding a patient, was commonplace. The idea was to drain bad blood, which supposedly caused fevers and infections. Barbers often handled this procedure. They'd slice a vein with a small lancet or use leeches to suck the blood out. The leftover red stains on their cloths earned them that iconic red and white striped pole outside the barber shop. People lined up for a quick bleed, believing it would balance their humors, those mysterious fluids that, according to theory, governed health and temperament. Yes, the four humors concept ran everything: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If these humors got out of balance, say too much blood or not enough black bile, symptoms appeared. Doctors might prescribe purges or laxatives, hoping to flush out the excess. Patients drank vile concoctions: strong herbs steeped in wine, liquids laced with metallic salts, or powders made from crushed beetles. The side effects could be brutal: vomiting, diarrhea, dizziness, but if the patient survived, folks claimed the remedy worked. Even diagnosing an illness relied on bizarre methods. A physician might inspect the color and smell of a patient's urine, comparing it to a chart that showed various shades of yellow, brown, or red. They believed each hue indicated a specific humor imbalance. Another approach was checking astrology charts to see if certain planetary alignments explained the sickness. Some swore by charms or amulets containing cryptic symbols, thinking these objects drew out evil forces responsible for disease. In filthy street markets, you might find charlatans peddling miracle cures, bottles of colored liquids boasting big promises. They might claim a mix of powdered horse hooves and rose petals could fix broken bones faster, or that dried snake parts ground into dust cured insomnia. Gullible or desperate, people paid coins they could barely spare. Of course, once they drank these potions, the only real effect might be a sore stomach or a bitter aftertaste. But who could say for sure? Stories spread about sudden recoveries, rare coincidences that fueled the hype. Many also depended on prayers and relics. A pilgrim might travel long distances to touch a saint's bone or sip water from a holy spring, hoping to be healed. Churches displayed relics with great ceremony: fragments of cloth, pieces of wood believed to be from sacred objects, and the faithful flocked to them in droves. Meanwhile, priests and monks recited special prayers, lit candles, and offered blessings. Was it spiritual power or placebo? It didn't matter to those who clung to any shred of hope. When the plague arrived in waves, it cut through towns like a scythe. People found themselves coughing up blood, suffering high fevers, and developing black swellings in their armpits or groins, buboes that oozed pus. Fear paralyzed entire regions. Families locked their doors, praying the sickness would pass them by. Others fled cities, carrying the disease to unsuspecting villages. Corpses piled up faster than they could be buried, and the stench of death haunted the narrow streets. In this crisis, remedies multiplied wildly. Some recommended burning aromatic wood or herbs, sage, rosemary, lavender, to clean the air. Others pinned fragrant posies to their clothes, convinced sweet smells would drive off the sickness. People burned tar or sulfur in their homes, creating toxic fumes that sometimes did more harm than good. Doctors wore beaked masks stuffed with herbs, believing it filtered out deadly miasmas. The sight of these masked figures, robed in black, became a symbol of dread. Quarantine was one strategy, though it wasn't well understood. Ships arriving in certain ports had to wait outside harbor for days or weeks. Towns locked gates to outsiders, hoping to contain the disease. But the plague often slipped through unnoticed, carried by fleas on rats that scurried through every alley. In desperation, some folk turned to flagellation, marching through the streets, whipping their own backs to atone for sins. They believed the plague was divine punishment, and that their suffering might spare the community. Crowds watched in horror or fascination as these processions passed by, chanting prayers and crying out in pain. Despite the chaos, a few tried more logical approaches to medicine. Certain healers recognized that healthy food, clean water, and rest could help the body fight disease. But in a world without germ theory, they had limited success. People believed in spontaneous generation, the idea that life and illness could pop up from nowhere, like flies emerging from rotting meat. This misconception stuck around for centuries, blocking real medical progress. Meanwhile, life expectancies remained heartbreakingly low. Even childbirth was risky. Midwives used herbs to ease pain, but complications could be deadly. Infections set in quickly without understanding of sterilization. A simple cut or tear during delivery could spell doom if it turned septic. Many women died in childbed, and the newborn's chances of surviving infancy weren't great. Families had to be prepared for tragedy, but that didn't lessen the sorrow when it happened. Surgery was brutal. Without anesthesia, the patient often bit down on a leather strap or a piece of wood to endure the agony. A surgeon might amputate a crushed limb or remove an arrowhead, relying on speed as the best form of pain relief. Blood spurted, assistants pinned the thrashing victim in place, and the smell of burnt flesh sometimes filled the room if they used a hot iron to cauterize wounds. No antiseptics, no antibiotics, just a hope that the body's own defenses would conquer infection. Certain monasteries provided more organized care. Monks with an interest in healing studied ancient texts, copying works by Galen or Hippocrates. They kept herb gardens, experimenting with different plants for teas or salves. These monastic infirmaries served travelers, pilgrims, and the local needy. Treatments could be primitive, but at least they offered shelter, food, and some measure of comfort. In a time when most had nowhere else to go, a monastery could be a lifesaver. Knowledge spread slowly. Printing was limited. Handwritten manuscripts were precious and rare. Physicians guarded their secrets, passing them only to chosen apprentices. So breakthroughs or new ideas took ages to circulate. Superstitions filled the gaps. Some believed wearing certain gems against the skin balanced humors. Others claimed chanting specific verses while rubbing an ailing joint could cure arthritis. Folk tradition and official medicine tangled into a messy web of potions, spells, and half-formed theories. Leprosy was another dreaded condition. Lepers were often shunned, forced to live in colonies outside city walls. People feared it spread through touch, so those afflicted rang bells to warn others of their approach. Church-run lazar houses offered some care, food, shelter, and daily prayers, but the stigma was enormous, isolating the sick from families and friends. Many spent their final years lonely, with rotting sores and collapsed noses, wondering what they had done to deserve such a fate. Rabies terrified people too. If a person was bitten by a mad dog, they often faced a grim end. Violent seizures, foaming at the mouth, sheer terror at the sight of water. There were stories of magic rituals to ward off the disease, like burning the dog's hair or reciting chants under the moon. None provided real immunity, of course. Without a proper vaccine, centuries away, victims were almost certainly doomed once symptoms appeared. Simple infections could kill. An infected tooth or a small cut that turned gangrenous might lead to fever, delirium, and death. Bathing was inconsistent. Some thought too much water could weaken the body, letting bad spirits or air slip in. Others worried about cold breezes after a bath, which could supposedly bring sickness. Soap existed, but wasn't universally used. Filthy conditions meant fleas, lice, and rats thrived. No wonder illnesses spread quickly in cramped, damp homes with minimal ventilation. And yet, people kept seeking cures in the strangest places. Consider powder of sympathy, a remedy said to heal wounds from afar. You sprinkled the powder on the weapon that caused the injury, not on the wound itself. There were rumors that placing a dead mole on your head could stop headaches, or that sleeping with a peeled onion next to your bed would absorb sickness. Wild? Absolutely. But in a world with so few scientific facts, folks latched onto any rumor of relief. Morgues, as we know them, didn't really exist. When someone died, the family rushed to bury the body, especially in times of plague, when fear of infection overshadowed everything else. Formal autopsies were rare, often discouraged by religious authorities who viewed cutting open the dead as sacrilege. Without dissection, knowledge of human anatomy stayed limited to second-hand works from ancient sources. Mistakes piled up, and guesswork ruled the day. The local apothecary, a sort of early pharmacist, blended ingredients into pills or potions, labeling them with cryptic symbols. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of dried plants, minerals, animal parts, sometimes exotic things like crushed beetles, snakeskins, or mammal organs. Customers placed their trust in these compounds. They might hobble home with a jar that smelled foul enough to make the neighbors complain. One never knew if the remedy was legitimate or pure quackery, but there weren't many alternatives. Still, some glimpses of progress emerged. A few curious scholars questioned the old teachings. They dissected animals in secret, noting how organs truly looked and worked. Others wrote about the importance of diet, cleanliness, and fresh air, some of the earliest inklings of public health ideas. But these voices were few, often ignored or ridiculed by traditionalist doctors and religious authorities. The road to modern medicine was steep and rocky. Meanwhile, everyday ailments like toothaches or indigestion were managed with simple home remedies. Chewing cloves for tooth pain, brewing mint or chamomile tea for upset stomachs. People learned from practical experience. If something tasted awful but seemed to help, they stuck with it. Mothers passed these household tips to daughters, forming an informal chain of basic knowledge that saved lives more often than the flashy miracle cures. A traveling healer might breeze into a village, set up a stall, and promise to fix everything from gout to infertility. Crowds gathered, enticed by bright flags and loud proclamations. The healer revealed small glass vials of colored liquids, each said to be a guaranteed cure. Children gawked at the displays, while worried parents scrounged up coins, hoping to help a sick child or an ailing grandparent. Once the healer moved on, so did the hope. Sometimes folks recovered, other times tragedy struck, leaving bitter disappointment and grief behind. Despite the chaos, people held on to faith, whether in religion, superstitions, or the wisdom of local midwives. The notion of spirits or demons causing disease was common. To chase them away, some banged pots, shouted incantations, or hung protective charms by the bed. If a fever broke, they credited the ritual. If the patient worsened, they blamed hidden sins or more powerful spirits. In that sense, mental fortitude might have been the best medicine people had, giving them the strength to keep going in a grim environment. No matter how odd these remedies sound, they represented a collective struggle to combat suffering with the limited tools available. Leeches, herbs, chants, and prayer were all attempts at control in a world where control was scarce. When danger lurked in every cough, every cut, and every rat scuttling underfoot, even the strangest cure might seem worth trying. After all, in those circumstances, wouldn't you cling to any possible solution? Imagine stepping into a cramped room where someone is struggling to get a fire going in a metal brazier. A faint glow flickers on a wooden tub filled with lukewarm water, maybe enough for one person to splash around if they're lucky. Bathing wasn't always a daily habit. People worried that soaking too often would open the body to illness, or that bathhouses might be magnets for trouble. Yet cleanliness wasn't entirely ignored. Some folks did try to stay fresh, just not in ways we'd recognize today. Clothes came in layers, undershirts, tunics, hose, maybe a cloak draped over the shoulders. Wealthy nobles showed off with fine fabrics dyed in vivid hues, bright reds, deep blues, and dark greens that boasted expensive pigments. They accessorized with embroidered hems and delicate trim. Others, especially peasants, wore drab browns, grays, and earth tones, mostly undyed or cheaply dyed cloth. Coarse wool itched the skin, and linen shirts soaked up sweat, if you were fortunate enough to own linen at all. Let's talk about these fabrics. Wool was popular for outer garments, warm in winter and somewhat durable in bad weather. Linen, spun from flax, was used for undergarments or summer clothing because it felt smoother against the skin. Silk? That was a luxury from far-off lands, reserved for the wealthiest individuals who wanted to flaunt their status. A single bolt of fine silk could cost a fortune. For most people, a new set of clothes was a major investment, something to be treasured and patched endlessly when it began to wear out. Peasant clothing might be handed down through several family members, each patch or repair telling a story of hard labor in the fields. Fabric didn't come cheap, and spinning or weaving at home took hours of work. A mother might spend long evenings by the dim glow of a candle, darning holes in her children's tunics. If you spotted someone with bright, pristine garments, that signaled money or position. Maybe they had a connection to a local lord or a successful trade. Fashion was also shaped by church rules and local laws. Sumptuary laws forbade people of certain classes from wearing specific colors or fabrics. You could be fined if you dared dress above your rank. It was a way to keep everyone in their place and avoid confusion over status. So, peasants rarely risked wearing flashy garments. They didn't want to face a penalty for seeming too proud or ambitious. Meanwhile, nobles flaunted elaborate hats, decorated belts, and shoes with pointy toes that extended comically far. Speaking of shoes, imagine walking around on muddy streets with nothing but thin leather between your feet and the muck. Many shoes were made of simple leather, sewn together by local cobblers. Styles varied. Peasants might have short, ankle-high boots or slip-on shoes, while the rich wore fancy poulain with elongated toes, so long that sometimes they had to be tied up with laces to keep from tripping. In wet weather, wooden pattens, like small raised platforms, protected delicate shoes from water and filth. The sound of clacking wood followed fashion-conscious folks through narrow alleys. Hair care was a curious affair. Without modern shampoos, some people used lye-based soaps, harsh stuff that could dry out scalp and skin. Others rinsed with vinegar or rosewater if they could afford it. Noble women often grew their hair long, braiding it or pinning it under veils and elaborate headpieces. A popular style involved wrapping hair in covers called cauls, delicate mesh or cloth frames that perched on each side of the head like small cages. Peasant women kept theirs simpler, maybe just a linen kerchief to keep hair out of the way while working. Men wore it short or shoulder length, sometimes trimmed around the ears. A nobleman might style it in a rounded bowl cut or let it flow in curls if he wanted to look fashionable. Beards went in and out of style. Some periods favored clean-shaven faces, while others saw knights with trimmed mustaches or even fuller beards. Shaving, however, wasn't always pleasant. Razors could be crude, and you had to rely on barbers who might double as surgeons or tooth pullers. A slip of the razor could leave a nasty nick, and there was no easy fix for infections if the cut got infected. So people approached a shave with caution, possibly steeling themselves with a gulp of ale beforehand to dull the nerves. Perfume, that existed, but it was largely for the wealthy who could import exotic scents. Floral oils, ambergris, or musk. Common folk might mask odor with simple floral sachets kept in clothing folds or pinned near the underarm. A whiff of lavender or rosemary could do wonders to cover sweat and the stale smell of rarely washed fabrics. Remember, clothes weren't tossed in a machine every day. Washing meant lugging water, boiling it over a fire, then scrubbing garments with handmade soap or ash-based mixtures. The results could be rough on delicate cloth, so frequent laundering wasn't practical. When it came to baths, some towns had communal bathhouses. People gathered there, not always separated by gender, stripped down and soaked in large wooden tubs or pools. It could be social or even rowdy at times. Steam filled the air, heated by stoves or furnaces. But concerns grew. Moralists complained about mixed bathing leading to immoral behavior, and outbreaks of disease sometimes made people suspicious of public tubs. Over time, many communities closed or restricted bathhouses. That left individuals to wash at home if they had enough water and could heat it. In winter, lugging buckets from a frozen well wasn't easy. Dental hygiene was hardly advanced. You might find a wealthy person polishing teeth with cloth dipped in salt or vinegar. Others chewed twigs or aromatic herbs to freshen breath. Tooth decay ran rampant, and blackened, rotting teeth were common, especially among higher status folks who ate sweet treats. Peasants had simpler diets with fewer sweets but lacked access to any real dental care. When a toothache became unbearable, you visited the barber surgeon for an extraction. No anesthesia, just a firm yank with metal forceps. The screaming could draw a crowd. Body odors were masked by layering clothes or dabbing on scented oils if you had them. But in cramped quarters, the smell of unwashed bodies mixed with smoke from hearth fires, the odor of spilled cooking fat, and the pungent whiff of chamber pots. People tried to open shutters to let in fresh air, but in cold months, that felt risky. Some believed a cold draft carried disease. So households endured stale, sweaty atmospheres, especially if a bunch of family members and farm animals shared the same space. Fingernails were trimmed with small knives or simply bitten off. No fancy clippers. Ladies of the upper class might buff their nails with rough cloth or oil them to keep them from splitting. Many wore thin gloves when outdoors to protect their hands from sun and grime. Peasant hands, on the other hand, were often cracked, calloused, and stained with dirt from fieldwork. A quick rinse in a barrel of water might pass for washing before meals. Head lice were a constant nuisance. Kids and adults alike scratched their scalps, hoping to rid themselves of crawling parasites. Some combed their hair with fine-toothed combs, while others tried herbal rinses or strong vinegar solutions to kill the eggs. If that failed, they might shave the hair off entirely. Fleas also infested bedding and clothes, making nights miserable. People burned herbs in living spaces, believing the pungent smoke could chase away insects or at least cover the stench of infestation. Skincare was minimal. Some used simple ointments made from animal fats, beeswax, or crushed herbs. A wealthy lady might smooth her face with concoctions containing lead or mercury, unaware of the long-term poison they were absorbing. Pale skin was prized among noblewomen, signaling that they didn't labor in the sun like peasants did. So they dusted faces with chalky powders or wore thick veils outdoors to maintain that ghostly complexion. The rest of society just dealt with sunburns, wind-chapped cheeks, and rough skin without complaint. Children rarely got special attire. They wore miniature versions of adult clothes, sometimes just a simple tunic tied at the waist. Shoes might be optional, especially in warmer seasons. Dirt-smeared kids ran around barefoot, playing with sticks, chasing chickens, or skipping through puddles. Bath time might be a quick douse if the parents insisted. Otherwise, the daily grime collected freely. By adulthood, those children understood that hygiene was more about practicality than luxury. Vanity existed, of course. Nobles wanted to show off status with jeweled brooches, gold chains, or belts decorated with silver studs. Ladies added ribbons, veils, or decorative pins to hold elaborate hairstyles in place. Some men carried daggers with fancy hilts, doubling as both fashion accessories and real weapons. A swirling cloak or a tailored tunic could speak volumes about rank, even if the color had faded over time. Tailors who specialized in fine garments served the rich in bustling cities, crafting fitted doublets or ornate gowns that turned heads at feasts. Seasonal changes called for adjustments in clothing. In winter, thick cloaks lined with fur kept out the biting cold. Fox, squirrel, or ermine if you had the coin. Inside castle halls, ladies wrapped themselves in shawls, and men wore layered tunics or a thick houppelande with long trailing sleeves. The poor layered whatever they owned, sometimes sleeping in the same clothes they worked in. Chilled breath was visible indoors if the hearth didn't provide enough warmth. People huddled close to fires, warming hands and feet, occasionally rotating to prevent one side from freezing. Head coverings were almost universal. Hats or hoods offered protection from the elements and a measure of modesty. For a nobleman, a fashionable chaperon with a draped tail showed flair. Peasants stuck with simple hoods or coifs, tied under the chin. Women wore wimples around the neck and chin, plus a veil or headscarf on top. Showing loose hair could be scandalous in some regions, reserved for special festivities or private gatherings. Even then, some frowned on it, calling it vanity or a distraction from moral virtues. Fragrance wasn't just for personal use. Some households strewed herbs and rushes on floors, hoping the smell would mask odors of daily life. Bay leaves, lavender, or mint might be crushed underfoot, releasing a fresher aroma. Over time, that mix of leaves and straw grew filthy, but folks replaced it only occasionally. The debris piled up with scraps of food, spilled drink, and who knows what else. Still, stepping on aromatic rushes offered a fleeting sense of cleanliness in a musty hall. Jewelry might include rings, necklaces, and bracelets. Peasants wore simple wooden or leather tokens if they wore any ornament at all. The rich showed off gold, silver, gemstones, or pearls. Rings could signal marriage, friendship, or allegiance. A knight might display a signet ring with a coat of arms, used to seal important letters in wax. Ladies flaunted elaborate necklaces or circlets in their hair during special occasions. Yet these were prime targets for thieves. Wearing jewels in public could invite trouble. When traveling, clothing had to be practical. A cloak protected against rain, dust, and biting insects. Some roads were so muddy that hems dragged in filth, leading travelers to hitch up their garments or carry extra sets. Merchants who roamed from town to town might adopt sturdy boots, layered tunics, and large hats to block the sun. Bathing on the road was even less common, perhaps a quick wash in a stream, if one felt brave about chilly water and potential bandits lurking nearby. Despite all these challenges, people took pride in their appearance when they could. A village girl might wear a simple garland of flowers at a fair, or a young man might dust off his best tunic for a church feast day. There was joy in dressing up, even if dressing up simply meant slightly cleaner clothes, a braided hairstyle, or a new belt carved from a decent piece of leather. Community events, weddings, harvest festivals, religious celebrations encouraged a bit more sparkle than usual. Some traveling entertainers, jugglers, minstrels donned flamboyant outfits to attract attention. Patchwork cloaks sewn from scraps of various colors, jangling bells attached to hats, face paint made from soot or berries, anything to stand out in a crowd. Children shrieked in delight, chasing after these performers to catch a glimpse of the unusual attire. Merchants, too, sometimes wore bright clothes to signal wealth or approachability, hoping to lure customers at the local market. In the absence of reliable deodorants or daily baths, social norms adjusted. People accepted that body odors were part of life, though stronger smells might still warrant a sour expression or a step back. If a noble complained about a peasant's stench, the peasant might grumble under breath, thinking, "We can't all afford scented soap and servants." Class divisions extended even to the way people smelled. Strange but true. Yet among their own circles, many folks barely noticed the odor, as it was simply everywhere. Hygiene routines might appear slack to modern eyes, but in an era where water had to be drawn by hand, soap was handmade or costly, and disease was poorly understood, these practices made sense. People balanced tradition, superstition, and practicality. They used what they had, local herbs, a well-worn comb, or a chipped wooden tub heated over a smoky fire. It wasn't luxurious, but it was life. And every so often, a festival or feast day let them put on something a bit nicer, wash up more thoroughly, and forget the day-to-day grime, at least for a night. Picture a smoky kitchen, light streaming in through a single high window. At the center, a huge cauldron hangs over a crackling fire, bubbles rising to the surface of a thick stew. The smell of boiling meat and herbs fills the air, mingling with the pungent odor of smoke. A tired cook, apron splattered with drippings, tosses in handfuls of onions and a few wrinkled carrots. This is dinner for a hard-working family, simple fare, using whatever they can find. Bread was the cornerstone of daily meals for many. If you were lucky enough to have wheat flour, you baked loaves that were relatively soft. But a lot of folks had to rely on rye or barley, producing darker, heavier bread. It could be tough on the teeth, especially if it went stale. Some used stale bread as a makeshift bowl, called a trencher, to hold stew or gravy. You ate the softer bits and tossed the soggy leftovers to the dogs or pigs. Nothing went to waste. Meat was expensive, Most peasants rarely tasted beef or mutton unless there was a special occasion or a windfall. Instead, they relied on smaller game like rabbits, chickens, or pigeons, if they could catch or raise them. Fish was crucial too, especially on days when religious rules forbade eating flesh. Fresh fish was a treat if you lived near a river or coastline. Otherwise, salted or smoked fish had to do. A whiff of salted herring or dried cod hung in many homes, pungent and briny, a sign of winter rations or poor times. Salt was precious, used not just to season but to preserve. People salted down meat in barrels to keep it from spoiling when fresh cuts were scarce. Pickling was another strategy, submerging vegetables in vinegar or brine for later consumption. Cabbage, onions, cucumbers, whatever grew in the garden could be pickled if you had the supplies. Those sour bursts of flavor livened up meals during bleak winters, when fresh produce was nowhere to be found. Spices dazzled the wealthy: cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, saffron, exotic treasures brought in by traders traveling risky routes. A pinch of pepper might cost a day's wages if you lived far from major trading hubs. For nobles, lavish feasts featured heavily spiced dishes: roasted swan sprinkled with exotic seasonings, pies stuffed with minced pork flavored with ginger and saffron, or sugary pastries laced with cinnamon. Meanwhile, peasants stuck to local herbs: sage, thyme, rosemary, grown in little plots near the kitchen door. Those had to suffice for daily cooking. At feast time, grand tables groaned under the weight of extravagant dishes. Picture a roasted pig's head, teeth bared, and apple jammed in its mouth. Surrounding it, platters of game birds like pheasants or peacocks with plumage arranged back on top for show. Sometimes cooks colored food with natural dyes: saffron for golden hues, chopped parsley for green, to amaze guests. They even molded jellies into whimsical shapes: castles, animals, or mythical creatures. Revelers gawked at the array, feeling a heady excitement at the sheer abundance of food. Wealthy banquets brought out multiple courses. First, delicate soups or broths, perhaps thickened with almond milk. Then, fish courses: trout, salmon, or eel prepared in sauce. After that, heavier meats: roast beef, venison, capons, served with bread and wine. And finally, sweets: fruit tarts, spiced cakes, or candied nuts. Wine flowed freely, sometimes mulled with sugar and spices. Musicians played lively tunes while jugglers entertained, adding a sense of spectacle. If you were invited to such a feast, you feasted indeed. But not everyone lived in that world of plenty. Peasants mostly ate pottages, thick soups with bits of vegetables, beans, and maybe a bone for flavor. They might have porridge made from oats or barley, boiled in water or skimmed milk if they had a cow. A scattering of peas or lentils added bulk. If a family had a small garden, they grew onions, leeks, garlic, and leafy greens. Around harvest time, they might enjoy fresh produce for a short spell before preserving whatever they could for the cold months ahead. Hunger was a constant threat. A bad harvest meant disaster. Grain prices soared, families had to ration bread, and children went to bed hungry. Some scoured forests for wild berries, nuts, or mushrooms. Others ate chestnuts or acorns after complicated processes to remove bitterness. In desperate times, folks ground up tree bark or added sawdust to flour to stretch it. The resulting bread was harsh on the stomach, scraping its way through an already malnourished body. Famine turned once thriving communities into skeletons of their former selves. Markets and fairs were a highlight for those who could attend. Stalls displayed goods like cheeses, sausages, honey, and fresh-baked treats. The smell of grilled meats, spiced pastries, and hot cider tempted passers-by. A thrifty shopper might haggle for a wedge of cheese or a slice of pork. Street vendors hawked meat pies wrapped in buttery crust, some possibly hiding dubious ingredients, so you had to trust the cook's honesty. Yet the hustle and bustle, the crackle of sizzling pans, and the bright chatter made these fairs exciting breaks from daily routines. Local specialties existed everywhere. Coastal regions boasted salted fish or shellfish. Mountain villages crafted hearty stews with goat or sheep. Forested areas might rely on wild mushrooms, berries, or game. And let's not forget the wine regions, where vineyards thrived on sunny slopes. Casks of red or white wine stored in cool cellars were prized assets. Beer and ale also poured in abundance, especially in the colder lands. Households brewed their own, flavoring it with herbs like gruyt or later with hops, creating a beverage safer to drink than questionable water sources. Water quality was a problem. Wells could be contaminated by nearby latrines or rotting refuse. Streams were sometimes used for washing clothes, dumping waste, or watering livestock, all upstream from where someone else dipped a bucket. Boiling helped, but that took time and fuel. Hence the popularity of ale and weak beer, low in alcohol but safer than plain water. Children drank watered-down ale, and travelers carried small barrels or flasks. If you had money and lived near a fresh spring, that was a luxury indeed. Cool, clear water untainted by sewage. Cooking equipment varied by household wealth. In a peasant hut, a single iron pot might serve all purposes: boiling, stewing, heating water. In a wealthy manor, multiple pots, pans, spits, and even specialized utensils existed. A cook might use a mortar and pestle to grind spices, a skimming ladle to remove foam from boiling broth, and large knives to carve poultry or slice bread. Ovens were sometimes communal. Villagers took their dough to a shared bakehouse, paying a small fee or portion of bread to the owner. Food presentation was an art at noble feasts. Servants carved meats at the table, showing off skill with swift, precise cuts. Platters were decorated with fresh herbs, edible flowers, or gilded details brushed on with egg yolk and gold flakes. Sweet or savory pies might be sealed with elaborate pastry designs. The more extravagant the display, the more honor it brought the host, proving wealth and generosity. Meanwhile, everyday folks made do with battered bowls or wooden trenchers, grateful if there was enough to fill everyone's bellies. Certain cooking methods emerged. Spit roasting large chunks of meat, turning them slowly over open flames, was popular for feasts. Baking bread in stone ovens gave a crusty exterior. Stewing ingredients in a cauldron allowed flavors to blend over hours, which made tough cuts of meat edible. Frying was less common. Lard or oil could be expensive, but some used shallow pans to sizzle small fish, fritters, or onions. The sizzling sounds and smells drifting from a kitchen could make mouths water blocks away. Herbs and vegetables weren't always a main focus. Meat often symbolized status. But in lean times, turnips, parsnips, cabbage, and peas became staples. Garlic and onions added flavor if you had them, though their strong odor stuck around. Some people used vinegar-based sauces to spice up bland dishes. Almond milk served as a creamy base for soups or sweet puddings, especially on fasting days when dairy from animals was off limits. The church calendar shaped meals profoundly. Meatless days meant creative recipes with fish, eggs, or legumes. Sweeteners included honey, if you tended beehives or could afford it, and sometimes fruit juices. Refined sugar was very expensive, so only the rich indulged in sugary confections or preserved fruits. Middle-class and poorer folks got sweetness from dried fruits like figs, dates, or raisins. Puddings made from boiled grains sweetened with fruit or honey counted as a big treat. Children squealed with delight at the chance to taste anything sweet, eagerly licking sticky fingers afterwards. Social class determined where you ate, too. Peasants ate in their huts or out in the fields, possibly seated on logs or simple benches, sharing a communal pot of stew. In a noble household, a great hall might be set with long tables, the lord at the head. Dishes were served in order, with servers bringing new platters and removing empties. Diners used knives to spear food. Forks were rare in some regions, so people often ate with fingers or spoons. Napkins weren't always common. Some wiped greasy fingers on tablecloths or the edges of bread. Table manners could be elaborate among the elite. They had rules about which hand to use, how to cut meat without appearing rude, and when to drink. Talking with your mouth full was frowned upon, though it still happened. Belching loudly might be excused as a sign of appreciation, or scolded as poor form, depending on local customs. Meanwhile, peasants barely worried about such etiquette. They just needed to get enough food down to keep working. Festivals and holy days offered a break from mundane diets. At harvest festivals, villagers baked special loaves from newly milled flour, roasted chickens or pigs, and danced around bonfires. At weddings, families pooled resources to provide bread, ale, maybe even a sweet cake or pastry for guests. The bride and groom took the first bites, symbolizing future prosperity. These events lit up the dull routines, forging camaraderie as neighbors shared in the bounty. Even those who toiled in poverty all year might get a moment to savor something special. Food also carried deeper meanings. Certain dishes were reserved for mourning feasts, meant to comfort the grieving. Some foods were linked to superstitions. Garlic might ward off evil, eggs symbolized new life, fish represented piety. The shape of bread loaves could hint at religious devotion or local tradition. For instance, cross marks were sometimes slashed into dough, a habit people believed would protect the loaf from ruin or mold. In a world where spiritual beliefs tied to everyday survival, these small customs mattered. Merchants introduced new flavors as trade networks grew. From distant lands, shipments of olives, citrus fruits, rice, or almonds occasionally reached wealthier kitchens. People marveled at the exotic taste of oranges or sweet candied fruits from overseas. While most peasants never saw such delicacies, the upper classes hosted banquets featuring them as novelties. These glimpses of faraway lands fed imaginations about the wider world. Despite everything, scarcity was always lurking. Drought, floods, or locusts could destroy crops, leaving entire villages in despair. In those times, bread riots erupted. Angry mobs stormed storerooms or markets, demanding fair prices. Lords and kings tried to regulate grain costs, sometimes imposing severe punishment on hoarders. Starvation led to desperation. There were whispered tales of people hunting stray dogs, cats, or even worse. Such stories were rarely spoken aloud, but fear of hunger pressed on every heart. Yet, when fortunes improved, communities celebrated with meals that connected everyone. Alahouses and taverns bustled with chatter, the air thick with smoke and the smell of simmering pottage on the hearth. Jugs of beer or cider passed around, travelers swapped news, and locals unraveled gossip over shared loaves of bread. Food was life, a momentary escape from worries, a reminder that despite hardships, people could still find warmth in a shared meal and a friendly face across the table.